What is insurance?
Sure. Insurance transfers certain risks between parties.
Without insurance, the economy would really stop.
In simple terms, insurance is like community.
It's protecting every last asset that somebody has built over a lifetime.
You're in it together. You feel supported.
From the beginning to the end.
What insurance is just taking care of people. It's definitely a way of life.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the GlobeDocs screening of the documentary In a Different Key. My name is Lauren King, and I'm very honored to have with us the co-producers and co-directors of the film. We have John Donvan and Karen Sucker. So I'm really happy that Karen, I'm sorry about that. It's Zucker.
Okay, Zucker.
Zucker. Welcome, and we're happy to have you here. I look forward to discussing the film with you, and I'd like to remind the audience that we will be taking questions from audience members at the end of our discussion, so feel free to type in a question in the chat box at the bottom of your screen, and I'll get to those later for John and Karen. So let me start with both of you. Obviously, my questions can be answered by either one, but jump in if you have a different answer. I just want to know, your book, In a Different Key, was very successful. What made you want to adapt it into a film? And what were the elements of the story you told in the book, the stories that you felt lent itself to a visual component in a documentary? And either one.
I always wanted to do a documentary. I was a news producer, and that's sort of my area of expertise. And John is really the gifted writer, and we started the book a very long time ago, but that was his initial goal, was to do the history of autism, and the film is not the history of autism. It touches on it, but is really much more contemporary, and takes you to a different level and expands things in a different way. So they have overlap, but they're also very different. And I think that they're very powerful, but also independently of one another. They stand on their own.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I would imagine between you said the book took a long time, between the publication of the book, I believe that was 2016, and the film, you probably learned a lot, and there might have been some things you wanted to include in the film that weren't in the book.
Yeah, there were a couple of topics that there were aspects of autism and autistic experience that really were not so obvious in the past, and we learned once the book came out and we started touring with it, we met more people who were telling us their stories and different kinds of stories, and we included those in the film because we hadn't in the book. So the really clearest example is that the idea that there's racism in autism affecting autism diagnosis still today. I mean, we knew, and we mentioned in the past, that there was a time when 50, 60 years ago, it was very difficult for a Black child who's autistic to get an accurate diagnosis, primarily because the profile of a diagnostic child in those days was incorrectly always included coming from a family of sort of super intellectual people. There was a pattern noticed, it seemed, and this was incorrect, but a pattern had been noticed that a lot of the kids who were being diagnosed 50, 60 years ago, their parents were academics or heads of companies, things like that. And so this notion took hold that there was something about the parenting of these super highly systematic, very bright people that was leading to their kids being autistic. So that theory was wrong. But
and racist also back then.
Because the consequence of that theory was that oh, by the way, that means no Black kids can be autistic because their parents can never fit that profile. And so that was 50, 60 years ago. But we learned that the problem persists. And we, when the book came out, we met people people of color who told us about their experiences and the difficulties that they still had getting diagnosed. Not because that theory was in place, but because there was a more generalized tendency, particularly with young Black boys, if they were behaving in a way that was not typical, they would ascribe it to something else, like that they were mentally slow, or that they had extreme emotional problems, things like that. So that was an example of something that wasn't in the book, that, as you say, Lauren, was more something that we learned and became aware of in the years since the book was published.
And needed to be talked about, because it
Yeah.
wasn't being talked about. I mean, you knew it was sort of black and white if you look 50 years ago, how wrong that was. But today nobody's was talking about that. So it really was some kind of almost an unconscious racism, which is even more problematic in some ways.
Yeah. No, I'm glad you brought I was struck by that. Yeah, it's such an important point in the film. The other part that I thought was amazing was, you start out and we're seeing different cases, and they're also interesting and they're also compelling. And then you include the whole spectrum, that not everyone is, and I think the phrase is, autism is almost the word autism is almost meaningless now. And I was very struck by that, because it can mean so many things. And that one of the parents says it should be autisms, because there's so many different kinds. So the inclusivity was of all these different types of individuals was very compelling in the film.
So we in the book, we because again the book kind of covered what was happening with around the diagnosis from the time it was first crystallized in the 1940s up to the time the book was published in 2016, and it followed it chronologically. And the extension of the diagnosis of autism to include people who are much more capable of independent life, but nevertheless had serious social and sometimes communications challenges, was a late development. It was really only since the 1990s that you could imagine, for example, somebody who is a college professor getting an autism diagnosis, because that individual would be in so many ways just so competent, sometimes even brilliant. And that development didn't happen with the diagnosis until kind of the late 80s into the 90s, early 2000s. At the time, the diagnosis was called Asperger's syndrome. But then in 2013, Asperger's syndrome was done away with as a category, and people who had the diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome now had an autism diagnosis. They were grouped together with people who more classically were defined as being autistic. So, suddenly you have a group of people in the conversation who don't have the same perspective of somebody who's like very challenged, by which I mean intellectual disability, needing 24-hour care. My brother-in-law is in that group. He lives in Israel. He's in his mid-50s, and he was diagnosed in the 1970s. He has very little language. He's not a college professor. He needs to be taken care of all day long. So a new group of people came into the conversation, and in our book, we they appear the later chapters of our book, because this group of people appeared into the autism conversation later in the sort of the course of history. In the movie, they're much more present, people with that group, because it's just a fact today that people who can speak for themselves, who take pride in who they are as autistic people, are much more part of a conversation, of the conversation, than they had been in the past, and in some ways are leading the conversation.
Yeah. Karen, tell me a little bit more about your visits to Forest, Mississippi, where Donald lives. Obviously you knew you would always be going there as part of the film, but were there any surprise? It was was so revelatory to get to make that trip with you, and to see his community and to see him interacting with everyone. So you must have known that would be a key element to the story.
Well, I think the big surprise for us is that when we went to go visit him for the first time, and we actually asked permission of friends and his brother if we could meet with him, that that we were told, well, we'll introduce you to Donald, but if you mess with him in any way, we will track you down and we will get you. And so even before we arrived in Forest, we knew that Forest was a very special place. It wasn't like a place like other places, that you could already sense this community that had surrounded him his whole life and was protecting him even before we, stepped off the plane. We knew that Forest was a unique place.
Yeah. The weaving of his story with the other stories was so beautifully done in the film. Also, I was very charmed by you including your own son with Mickey, Karen. Did you have any reservations about that, or did you know from the beginning you wanted him to be part of the story?
I absolutely did not want him to be part of the story. I didn't want to be part of the story. As a journalist and producer, I spent my life behind the scenes and wanted to sort of stay that way. But I will say now, to John's credit, it was his idea, and it was the best way to really weave the story together and give another perspective of someone with autism, which was my son. But using me as the storyteller to a certain extent enabled us to weave all the stories together, which is to a large extent why we did it. And also because my son Mickey's, he's charming in his own way.
Yeah. That's interesting that you mentioned that, because I did want to ask about your long professional partnership with making this film in a different key. That's one example how a partnership can help one another get over some resistance or make things better, or just knowing each other's strengths. Was that the case? Because you co-produced and co-directed the film, right?
Well, John is for 30, 40 years was a correspondent at ABC News and PBS and CNN, and traveled all over the world. He was the face, he was the person who told the stories. So that was really not my forte. But
well, you do. I mean, you were great on camera, John. I'm sure you knew that Karen would rise to that occasion, because you do bring something very special to the film, Karen.
Thank you.
Yeah, honestly, I think this happens in any sort of creative partnership. There were some strains almost to the breaking point actually in writing both in writing the book and in making the film, and there were two different kinds of strains. And in the end, I think we bring different strengths, and it's the outcome is better for it. That we do have different perspectives. I mentioned I have a brother-in-law, but that's not nearly as close as having a child on the spectrum, and Karen had that, and so she had concerns at every stage about wanting to protect the people who were in the film and protect their dignity, and I respect that. I had to respect that, and at the same time, I was constantly pushing her to put more of herself into the film, to put more of her son into the film, and we kind of worked out a balance. And for me, actually, it was a relief to not be, for once, not to be the guy on camera and to be behind the scenes. And but I was sympathetic to Karen's stresses going through that. But in the end, I don't think that stress shows at all in the film. And
or the fact that we're still talking to one another.
Yes, sometimes. Yeah.
Well, because so many of the participants are parents, Karen, did you find that they may have opened up to you more in the interviews as a parent who understood?
Yeah, I mean, I think that started when we were working on the book.
Mhm.
That And in fact, for 20 years, we covered autism for ABC News. And, very early on, I found that particularly parents would, feel more comfortable and trust me that at the end of the day that John and I would produce something that would be fair and that would be honest, because there was a commitment to the story being told in the right way. And so I think that that's what we've done for a very long time. But I do think that people who might not have told their stories because of both of our backgrounds.
It was quite, obviously in the film, you were able to show clips that you may have referenced in the book, but you couldn't show. I was very struck by some of the archival footage, and then the clip from that Minority of One, which was in the section about the Lapin family.
Mhm.
How?
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm just wondering how it felt to put that together visually, because it was so compelling to think of. It felt so long ago, and it isn't. I mean, it isn't
Yeah.
that sort of thing that happens with historical footage.
That's interesting, Lauren, because I thought about that a lot too. There's sections of the film, people haven't seen it, where we found documentaries that were made about autism 50 or 60 years ago. And I'm 68 years old. So 1971 for me, I was 16 years old. I wasn't a kid anymore. I can remember going to movies, and I can remember, driving in, whatever the hot new car of the year was, whatever that car was. Not that I was driving in it, but I was aware of what it was, and I was aware of where the Mets were, that there was a whole world going on that to me is almost, like last week. But then when you look at these documentaries that's made in 1971 about autism, they feel like 150 years ago, 200 years ago in terms of their attitudes. And so the Lapin family in California were in this documentary that somebody told us about years ago, and we watched a copy of it that was somebody had made a VHS of a VHS of a VHS, and we saw these people in this fuzzy video talking about how badly their son was being treated by the school system in California in the 1960s and the 1970s, and their battle to try to change things. And then we found them, and they were still going. They were at that point in their 70s, now they're in their 80s, and they were still fighting for him, for the challenges that he's facing today, which are primarily where is he going to live when they die, and who's going to support him when they die? What's the support system? And so in a way, it's another way in which it feels like last week, that the battles that they had battles for him 50 years ago, they have battles for him now, even though things have come such a long way in terms of support and in terms of attitudes. There's still such a long way to go. And to find one family over the course of what's 1971 to 52 years still fighting the battle, and seeing them still energized and energetic, was just such a powerful thing for us. And almost everybody, really everybody who's featured in the film, became a friend of ours, and they became friends because they're in the book also. They're part of the history. We really see them as representing. They're not the only family by any means that fought, but we made them kind of the representative of the families fighting. And we've stayed at their house, and we share good news with them, and vice versa. And they're just fantastic people who are still going.
Yeah, that was amazing to see them still in the State House in California.
Yeah,
doing that. Yeah, but since the film's been out, obviously the book a lot longer, but the film in particular, what have you been most rewarded by in terms of reaction, as people have gotten to see it? And
well, I would say one thing that really was important to us is that everybody who's in the film likes the film, and that includes Donald. Donald died in June. I don't know if you know that, and we can talk about going to his funeral, which was really quite an experience also. But Donald died in June, And we had been supported especially by his brother Oliver for years. Oliver was the one who, as Karen mentioned, we wanted to respect Donald's privacy. That's why we asked people to introduce us to him rather than just showing up on his doorstep. We wanted to give him the chance to say, no, I don't want to talk with you, without being stressed by us even asking. So that's why we went through his brother. His name was Oliver, and Oliver really became a friend of ours and a supporter of ours. And he was the most patient person in the world with us, because we asked him, can you just, please protect this story for us, just work with us, if, over the years, can we have an exclusive relationship with you and your family? And, with nothing being signed or anything else, he always said yes, and he always kept his word. But what made us sad is he would call us from 2016 on every 6 months, and when is that movie going to be finished? When is that movie going to be finished? And Oliver died about 6 months before the film was finished, so he never got to see it. But Donald did. And what happened was, we had our world premiere at a film festival held in Mississippi, in the town of Oxford, where the University of Mississippi is. That's where the state film festival is. And we submitted the film there. And Donald, it was about 2 or 3 hour drive for him and his family, but they came up to the film festival, and a whole bunch of people from his town came up to the film festival, and we had a screening with this whole community. And Donald really, really enjoyed the film, and he enjoyed the attention. And Karen and I were brought up to the stage to do Q&A afterwards, and then the moderator asked Donald to come up, and Donald came up, and I remember the MC, the moderator, who's a lovely guy, kind of didn't really get the fact that you do get from the film that Donald's not really a chatty person. So he kind of did a great big, Donald Triplett, what did you think of the movie? And Donald said, oh yes, I liked it very much. And then he just stopped talking. And there was like a long silence, and then everybody who knew Donald started clapping. So that was a nice response. But overall, we've seen response around the country. Last year, we went all over the country with the film, and people laughed and people cried, and the things that we hoped, the way that the film would touch people and inspire them, really came true. In fact, at that Oxford, Karen, you want to tell the story of that Oxford, that first film festival, the first hint we got of how it was impacting people?
Good. Yeah, because I'm not sure which story you're talking about.
So Oxford, Mississippi is a small town, and after the film festival, we were walking down the street the next day. There's like one main street to get some breakfast or lunch, and somebody stopped Karen because she had been to the film festival. And this was somebody who did not know Donald, did not know anything about autism. And she stopped Karen and said, I saw you in the movie, and I just want to tell you, I never really got it about autism before, but I totally get it now, and it's changed my life. It's changed how I'm going to see autistic people from now on. And that was for us like the home run impact that we made the film for. We always said we made the film not necessarily to touch and inspire the autism community, although we're happy it does that, but to reach everybody outside the autism community, whom we lovingly refer to as the civilians in the story. And we wanted to reach the civilians, touch the civilians, open their eyes, make them want to root for people on the spectrum, support people on the spectrum, be friends with people on the spectrum. The term these days is allies, which is not one we had in mind when we started, but I think it's that's what we're talking about. And we think that that's happening. So that's been a really nice impact in response to the film also.
I think the other thing that was really sort of shocking to us is that when Donald passed away just a few months ago, that his story was being told all over the world, internationally, in this country, full page obits, and we knew it was because we were able to tell his story, that now people knew, who Donald was, and that his name and his legacy and will live on forever. And that was the first time that I think that we saw kind of like this massive response to nobody had really known about the first person ever diagnosed with autism before the book or the film. So we were proud that his story was told all over the world when he passed away.
That's wonderful. When you were talking about John, when you were saying you had made the film for both people in the autism community and civilians, I was struck by something in the film about linking the success of Donald's life to the community he was in. And I think, Karen, you say in the film, like you would hope that could be true for everyone with autism, that there is an embrace and an understanding and a link between the world and them, that people aren't afraid of it or misunderstanding about it, confused by it, or etc. So in that sense, do you, I mean, the film's contribution in that way of just enlightening everyone to say this is all part of the human experience and not, and Donald's story is directly because of that. I mean, you show in the film that he was successful because of the community he lived in, and other factors too, which I think was great that you mentioned, that the privilege that his family had.
But we still think that that's the life that he led and the acceptance that he received from his community is unfortunately unique, and that there needs to be a lot. We need more forests all over the country, all over the world, and we're not there yet. And that's why the movie, after the book, because we still have a long way to go. But as long as we're talking about it, we're moving forward.
What's next for you both? Do you plan to pursue the topic again in another form? I know you have, I think you have a podcast. I went on the website, which audience members haven't visited. The website for In a Different Key is actually very informative. And
well, right now we're working on a toolkit that will go together with the film to educate not just in the school systems or universities, which of course we want to do, but everywhere, in businesses and police stations. We really want the story to get out there, and we think that combined with the toolkit, which will generate conversation, that we just keep getting that story out there. And that was the goal in doing the film, and we're not quite finished yet.
Yeah, it's why we I mentioned that Donald passed and that we went down to Forest in May. We first found out that he was sick. He died of cancer, and we first found out he was sick in April, and then his family wanted us to be in touch, and so then they told us near the end of May that he was in hospice. So we went down to see him, and he was not in a lot of pain at that point, and he was at home being taken care of. And on the way to his house, we flew down to Jackson. On the way to his house, we stopped at a Walmart, and Karen picked up a bag of rubber bands to give him as a gift, because he liked to shoot rubber bands at people. And we got to his house, and he was sitting in a lounge chair, had an oxygen thing in his nose, and he was totally there in terms of not being severe, medicated. He was just taking Tylenol at that point, even though he would die 3 weeks later. And we got the chance to say to him, to tell him, I think we basically, it was short, but we spent about an hour with him. But I said, Donald, I just want to say one thing to you. You have made a big difference in the world by trusting us to tell your story, and your story is out there, and your story is providing a lot of hope and a lot of inspiration to people, because the farther it goes, the more people hope that they can have what you had for themselves if they're on the spectrum, or for their kids if they have kids on the spectrum. And his response, kind of like the MC at the film festival, his response was, "Oh yes, thank you very much." And then he had nothing else to say. And then a few minutes later, Donald's nephew's wife, his niece by marriage, Ingrid, was with us, and he kind of dozed off. So we were just sitting on a couch chatting, and all of a sudden, wing, Karen gets hit in the face with a rubber band. So Donald had kind of aroused himself and gotten into the bag of rubber bands. We hadn't seen him do it, and give Karen a shot in the face. So that was lovely. And another lovely moment. So 3 weeks later, he passed away, and we went down again for his funeral. And the family asked us to speak at the ceremony, at the service. And so the church was packed. And we got up, and we thought the best thing that we could say to the community was that to tell them that through their response to Donald, they had been an incredible example to the world. That's why his story was so inspiring. It's because of how they had responded to Donald, and this mutually reinforcing thing going on, that he did well because they were good to him, and they were good to him because he did well, and he got better at navigating the world, being accepted, being included. And it was never an act of charity on the part of his community. It was an act of love. It was an act of appreciation. And at one point I asked who here was given a number by Donald. So you see in the film that he liked to give numbers to people, and Karen and I got numbers. You're 549 and I'm 550, right? Is that those
right.
are our numbers? Yeah. And so I said, who here in the congregation has a Donald number? And almost every hand went up. And then in the middle of the church, people started calling out their numbers. And it was a really, really lovely, very unique moment, attributable wholly to who this guy was in the community and how they had responded to him all his lives and their lives.
Wow. Amazing. The story continues to be amazing.
Yeah.
I would invite anyone who's joining us on the call. We don't have a lot of time left. If you want to get a question in for Karen or John, to type it into the chat. I do want to ask about the technical contributions across the board to the film. I mean, it looks great. It's beautifully edited, but of course the music struck me. How did you get Wynton Marsalis to compose the score for the film, which is lovely?
That's a Karen story.
That's a Karen story.
Well, Wynton has a brother with autism, and we knew about that. I knew about that very early on when my son was first diagnosed, and we were just talking. It would be really great to get Wynton to do the score. And so John said, "Well, yeah, that would be great, but that'll never happen." And then we asked him. We were able to, get a message to him. I asked him, and he said yes, because he's just an incredible guy. And we went to the studio one day, and he just wrote this spectacular score. And he had, students that he'd worked with before who were part of the recording. And we had sent him parts of the film. So certain sections were, one section was called Cosmos, and one was called Math, and one was called Community. And so he wrote to the film, but he also, I think, he shared with us that part of it was, his experience with his brother, that gave him the inspiration to, write such a beautiful score.
Yeah. Well, it really was lovely. Okay, we do have a couple of questions before we have to wrap. One attendee wants family and friends to see the film. Can they find it anywhere streaming?
Yes, it's on Amazon now. Under the PBS's got a kind of an Amazon page, and if you subscribe to the PBS part of Amazon, you can watch it for free, and if not, they sell it for I think $3, something like that. And if you are a PBS contributor, Amazon has PBS has a service called Passport, and you can watch it there. And the third way is that we're still licensing groups around the country to have group screenings, and those are continuing. We did a lot of those last year. Like we went to them, and we would go and speak too. We would be part of that process, and we would go and speak, and we did that in 23 or 24 states last year. So those are the ways to see it at the moment.
Great. Okay, another question, Miriam. Would like you to say a little bit more about racism and people on the autistic spectrum.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, it was something that that had kind of been in the story for a long time, but the fact that it was still continuing was something that we were aware of, but we weren't how aware of or what the dynamic of that was. And so we explored it in the film through Stephanie Parks, who is the anthropologist at UCLA, who is the mother of an autistic son. And she tells her own story in the film about how she saw this happen in action. And she saw that it wasn't a conscious racism that was at work. It wasn't somebody who was hostile or was trying to deny services to a Black family. It was sort of an unconscious categorizing of Black children and white children into separate categories of whatever their challenge was. And so, but her concern, and the concern, is that autistic kids needs certain kinds of services, and if they're not getting them because they're not getting the diagnosis, the earlier that a child can get help and support and treatment, the better the outcome's going to be. And very, very often the Black kids and Latino kids would not get it early because somebody would make a wrong call. And the wrong call would come from these attitudes about, how the diagnosticians, who are mostly white, would unconsciously interpret behaviors. And so there's a really serious cost to the individuals and the families if they don't get that help early. Now this has become, when we showed the film around the country, many people who were experts in the world of autism had never heard this until they saw our film. So it was kind of a undercovered reality. Our film has helped that to some degree, but also just in general, the professions are beginning to be aware of this problem. And in the last round of prevalence studies, it looks like the diagnosis of Black kids is beginning to catch up, but Latino kids is still lagging. So that's kind of what the situation is now and what we go into in the film.
Thank you. Molly mentions the single father who was caring for his son, and his understandable concern about his son's care when the father is gone. Do you have any vision for a solution or any real life solutions in this situation?
Well, I think that's something that scares every parent who has a child with autism. That I think that Seamus and Jason, who's the dad, struggles today with much more difficulty because they don't have the services and they don't have the opportunities, and the school systems don't provide the same kind of support based on where you live and the area that you're in, and like any area that is does not have the appropriate services. But the problem of what's going to happen when I die is universal, because no matter how much money you have, there's not a great wealth of places and people caring for adults with autism. And I don't know what I'm going to do, as much as I think Jason doesn't know what he's going to do. But the real issue is, the more severe your child is, when you die, the harder that will be to make sure that your kid, who's now an adult, is provided for.
Thank you. We have a teacher. This Heidi has written as a regular education teacher. The film provided her with additional insights about some of the students she's worked with over the years. Have you had any negative feedback on the film? And if so, what has that feedback been?
We haven't, and we thought that there might be, because the world of the autism community has its own politics and perceptions, and so we kind of thought there might be some pushback on some item or other, and we fortunately haven't experienced that yet.
Great. Okay. I'm going to have one more because we have still a few more minutes. Unless I want to make sure that John and Karen have anything that hasn't been addressed that you'd like to address, either by one of our attendees.
Well, there is a story that didn't get into the book and that didn't get into the movie.
Mm-hmm.
We could never find a way, especially in the movie. We thought, let's try to make this work, and we couldn't. So we liked, with audiences who have liked the movie, to share this piece that didn't get in. And it's a story about, again, that goes way back to the very first time we met Donald, which was in 2007. And we went down to Forest, and we'd had the introductions, and we met Donald, and Donald gave permission to tell his story. And then we began, we said, we want to talk to people in town about you, and is that okay with you? He said, absolutely. And so we started to meet people who knew Donald, and everybody we went to said, he's a genius, don't you? And we would say, what do you mean? He said, because he counted the bricks in the high school by looking at it for a few seconds. And everybody we went to told us about, he's a genius because he counted the bricks in the high school. And Donald indeed had a real facility with numbers and with calculation, and he liked numbers. He liked numbering people. He liked doing complex arithmetic in his head, and so this whole story was just like perfect, fantastic story about this guy who looked, well, the story, we asked, what's the story? And the story was that sometime in 1951 or so, when he was in high school, he stepped out of the front door of the school building, which was a big brick building, and a group of boys surrounded him, and they said, Donald, you're so good with numbers. Why don't you tell us how many bricks are in the high school? And as the story is told, he looked over his shoulder for a second, and then he looked back at them, and he threw out the number, and they were flabbergasted, I like to use that word. They were stunned, and they ran off, and they told their friends, and their friends told their friends, and then those people grew up and they told their children, who then told their grandchildren. So the time we get there, 60 years later, everybody in town knows this amazing story about Donald Triplett is so amazing that he could count the bricks in a building by looking at it for a few seconds. But there's a follow-up to that.
Which is one day we were hanging out and shooting the film or whatever else we were doing with him. I said, so Donald, how did you do it? How did you figure out how many bricks there were in the building? And he looked at me and he said, well, I didn't. I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, I made it up. So the sort of the moral of that story really was, I said to him, so why did you do that? And he just kind of looked at me and he said, I wanted the boys to like me. Mm. Which is, what everybody wants. Donald was no different than anybody else in terms of like wanting love and support and a community. I mean, it's what we all want. And if I was going to add anything before we wrap up, is to say, we want the civilians to see this film. It's great if people in the autism community and organizations around the country watch it and share it with their community. But we want employers and police officers and the medical profession. The film shows the breadth of the spectrum in a way that hasn't been ever told before.
Yeah.
And and we have something, that a toolkit that will go with it that will help, foster conversation. And the films, we want it to be seen everywhere, and that's why we created it.
We want teachers especially to see it, more than we want their students to see it, because I think kids today are attitudinally much more open than any generation before, but we want their teachers to see it. And we kind of, I think we want to get across the idea that everybody's different and people on the spectrum are different in some different ways, but that people on the spectrum are also pretty ordinary the way all of us are ordinary, that we have way more in common if we focus on that than we do on the differences. And we just we want neurotypical people to be rooting for autistic people and to be their support system, so that question, what happens to my child after I die, is not such a scary question anymore.
Because it's not so hard to have the back of somebody who's different. And that's really the message of the film.
Well, I'm really glad you shared it with us today for GlobeDocs, and really happy that you shared your time to come and talk about this amazing project. Thank you so much.
Thank
Karen,
you, Lauren.
Yes, thanks for having me, Billy.
And we also say thanks to GlobeDocs too.
Yeah.
Yes, and thank all of you who stuck around for this conversation and watched the film with us. And thank you again. It really sheds a lot of light on it to have your voices. So thank you so much, and thank all of you who are out there.
Bye bye.
Okay, thank you. Bye bye.
Bye.